Hi guys, it's Keith from IELTS Speaking Success, and it's great to be back with you. And we're starting a new year, 2020. And so I thought it would be nice to share with you some of the new IELTS speaking questions. Today I'm going to look at part 1, and these are the new questions that are in the bank of questions for 2020, January to April. So if you're taking your test in January, February, March or April this year, this will be really helpful to give you language ideas and all of the questions. Let's get into it. So, IELTS Speaking Part 1. These are the new questions that we've got for 2020, at least for the first 4 months. My name is Keith, and if you don't know me, I run the website IELTS Speaking Success, and on there I offer a variety of resources. I also do one-to-one teaching, group classes, and there are online courses there you can get as well. So check it out, www.ieltsspeakingsuccess.com. There's lots of stuff for you there, videos, model answers, everything your heart could desire, or almost. So, IELTS Part 1 in the speaking is important, right? It's your first impression, and it's where you really lay the groundwork to help the examiner decide what kind of a level you are. So it's really important that you're prepared well and give short but developed answers. Now, with the new questions that have come out, I'd like to share with you, these are the questions that candidates have reported and so that are being used in this new bank of questions. So let's kick off straight away with the first lot, and I'll share ideas, some language, and things, what this may mean to you, because some questions are not as clear as others. Number 1 is pens and pencils. Do you prefer to use a pen or a pencil for writing? Wow. I mean, for me personally, I prefer a pen, right? Because it's smoother and it has a feeling of permanence. And I guess it's kind of, it's the habit I have. I only ever use a pencil actually for drawing or maybe sketching something. So pens and pencils, right? I think it's an interesting question, and I suspect this has come into the question bank because of technology and the move now towards typing. Fewer and fewer children are handwriting stuff. They're not writing things down, they're typing. And some people think that's a bad thing because by writing with a pen, there's character, personality, you learn more according to research. Typing is a bit impersonal. So maybe this is why it's become one of the questions or one of the topics. So I think some useful language here is write down things. Okay, not only write things, but write down. It's much more natural to use a phrasal verb here. I like to note down my ideas. I like to write down my thoughts in a diary. Okay, or jot down, J-O-T, jot down your ideas. So maybe you use a pencil to jot down some messages for your wife or your family, something like that. Okay, maybe you use a pen when you're making a shopping list or a to-do list. These are all different ways we can use pens and pencils. The other questions. When was the last time you bought a pen or a pencil? I buy pens every week because my pens have a habit of disappearing. We have this expression in English, it grows wings. My pens grow wings because they seem to fly away. You know, I buy a box of 10 pens and within a week I've got one left. Where do they go? Like socks in the washing machine, they just seem to disappear. So I buy pens on a regular basis, actually, very cheap ones. What about you? Next question. How would you feel if someone gave you a pen or a pencil as a gift? I'd be really happy actually, provided it was a good quality pen, right? Get one of those high status, well-known brands. They're really nice pens, and they are a bit of a status symbol, right? When you write with those pens, if you're working, customers and colleagues will notice the brand of your pen. So I think it's nice to give pens as a gift, so long as they're good quality. So that's pens and pencils. Let's move on. Oh, cakes and desserts. Do you like eating cakes? Have you ever made a cake? Okay, cakes and desserts. Do you like having desserts? So, and the last question, what desserts are popular in your country? So the first thing to mention, I think, is the difference between cakes and desserts. So cakes are things like chocolate cakes, muffins, maybe pastries. All of those can be cakes that you buy in the baker's. Dessert is a part of a meal. You have your starter, your main course, and your dessert. In some parts of England, we call it the pudding. You know, pudding can be typically an ice cream or a cake or a tart or a crumble or a pie, apple pie, grandma's apple pie. My grandma's no longer here, but her apple pie still is. So dessert is part of a meal, whereas cake is a specific thing, right? So they're slightly different. So do you like eating cakes? Well, you'll probably talk about sponge cakes, chocolate cakes, pastries, maybe the sweetness. Maybe you have a sweet tooth if you really like sweet things, or you like the texture of cakes. They're kind of soft and spongy. Of course, they're not very good for you. Well, they're good for your mood and your happiness. They give you a rush of a certain hormone that I'm going to check because I've forgotten what the hormone is. Let me check. Endorphin or something. So chocolate's good, yes, because actually it releases endorphins. It's a hormone that it releases to your brain, and these endorphins make you a bit happy. So it's good in that sense. But of course, they have so much sugar that they're really bad for you and can lead to being overweight or obesity, potentially. So there are things there you can talk about. Have you ever made a cake? You'll probably want to say bake a cake, made a cake, as opposed to cooking. Have you ever made a cake? I have made lots of cakes. I'm a big fan of baking. You know, I love to spend like a Saturday afternoon getting my hands dirty, putting on my apron and baking cakes, whether it's chocolate or sponge cakes. I usually follow a recipe because I'm an amateur. I'm not that experienced. I'm not a seasoned cook. And so I have to follow the recipe. And I love just presenting the cake. I love the smell, the aroma of a freshly baked cake. And then when you tuck into it, oh, it's delicious with a nice cup of coffee, complemented by coffee. That is my idea of a good Saturday afternoon. So, baking cakes, lots of things you can talk about. Do you like having desserts, right? Is probably more about in your meals, maybe at lunchtime or dinner. So after you finish dinner, do you have a dessert? Do you have an ice cream? Do you have a pie? In Britain, it's quite common to have a dessert. I remember when I lived in China, desserts were not that common. Some people would have them, some restaurants would have them, but it wasn't as common as in England, I feel. But maybe that's our bane in England. That's why we have so many cakes, and that's why we're getting fatter and fatter. We are becoming an obese society. Oh dear. Now, let's move on. History. Now, this is an interesting topic. Now, here are the questions, right? Do you like history? Did you enjoy learning history when you were a child? So here, it's similar to the question about maths, right? It's talking about a subject at school and a subject that you like or study or read about. Another question: when was the last time you read about history? Do you think history is important? So all of these questions are similar to maths in that you're talking about a subject. So when we look at the language here, you may want to talk about ancient history, like the Egyptians, the Greeks, the Romans, the Aztecs, or whichever group of people you want to focus on. And you can talk about that period in time. You may want to talk about recent history or modern history, which is more the last 100 or 200 years. You know, I mean, our recent history has been plagued with war and conflict, right? We have a saying in English that history always repeats itself. So I think it's interesting that when we say, oh, it's good to learn from history, we can look back at World War I and World War II, and we can learn from history, and then history repeats itself. We start another war. It's crazy, right? But don't worry too much about that. Let's think about the language. So we can talk about history, how maybe we can learn from history, but I think history shapes our present. Shapes, makes a shape. So not a circle or a square, but it just defines our present. It shapes our present, and history shapes our future. So certainly, I think history is important. Do you think history is important? I think history is important because although history tends to repeat itself, it certainly shapes our present society. It defines a lot of the culture, the behavior, and the attitudes that we have. And when we look at geography and national boundaries and relationships between countries, it's essential that we understand the history behind those relationships so that we can become closer and learn from other cultures and countries. So there's lots to say about history and lots of things. I personally think history is connected with geography. So here's the thing, right? With the question about did you enjoy learning history when you were a child? I didn't. I found history boring and I didn't really understand it because it was an isolated subject. It was only when I started traveling the world, going to other countries and understanding the geography and the connection between the history, the geography, the culture, the language, that it all made sense. And it became really interesting for me. When I travel to a new city, I love to learn the history behind it, the buildings, the architecture, even the history of the food or the language, because I'm really into languages. So I have found now that I really enjoy history because I think it is connected to everything. It's also connected to literature, right? When you go back and you read Dostoevsky or Chekhov or Shakespeare or Voltaire, all of that, every book from history is actually a historical novel. It reveals something about the time and it shows us something about the culture. So, history, a great subject to talk about. Science. Now, this is another subject, right, at school, and similar questions. I think the subject of science has come up, has appeared, because of something called STEM, which is hugely popular now in many education circles and across the world. STEM is science, technology, engineering, and mathematics. And STEM is being promoted because there is going to be a need for more scientists in the future, especially computer scientists, people who can code, robotics, automation, all of that is growing in our society. So the need for governments to promote science as a subject. What's more, I have noticed they are promoting women in science and encouraging girls to study science. Something that was traditionally seen as a man's job and a man's subject, right? Isaac Newton, Einstein, all of these guys are guys. Where are the women? Well, there are, definitely, but fewer. in number. And so the promotion of science to more and more girls, I think is great. And maybe that's why it's come into IELTS, right? So the questions here are you interested in science? Well, that sounds difficult, but you could look at this from many angles, right? So maybe you don't read science books or the Science Journal. There's a famous magazine called The Scientist, which is actually really good, but it does touch on some quite difficult topics around astronomy, astrology, the earth, geography, chemistry, lots of difficult things. But you can look at this from many, many angles, right? Are you interested in science? Well, science surrounds us. There is science in cooking. Yes, believe it or not, right? When you put salt on your chips, there is a chemical reaction happening that brings out the flavour of the food. That's science. So it's interesting. When you melt butter in the pan, a solid becoming a liquid because of heat, that's science, right? So there is actually the science of cooking. There are many books that talk about the science of cooking. When you fix your car, if it breaks, you need to know the science. Or fix your bicycle, right? When you've got your inner tube in the tyre, and if there's a hole and the air's coming out, basic science. You need to plug the hole and then pump up the tyre. It's basic science. So knowing a little bit of science is quite useful. It's not essential. It's not studying science, but picking up bits of science, right? Picking up means learning just by doing, really. Picking up bits of science is really useful. I like the expression bite-sized chunks. Bite-sized chunks of science, or bite-sized chunks of language. So when you learn something and it's a bite, it's a little chunk, and you just learn one little bit at a time. You don't sit down with a big book and study the science. You just have bite-sized chunks of science. So I think picking up bite-sized chunks of science is really interesting and useful, right? Particularly, as I mentioned before, with computers. So many years ago, we needed to know the computer language, HTML, or is it HTLM? I always forget. HTML, I think. One of those acronyms. And nowadays, that's not necessary. You can make a website without knowing any coding at all. So in that sense, you don't really need to know the science. But behind the scenes, there's a lot of science going on. And it can be quite interesting and useful to know a bit of the science going on. Okay. So, science. Did you have science classes at school? Well, at primary school, you do have science class. When you get to secondary, they tend to split it up. And you've got chemistry, physics, and biology. You may have social sciences. So those are the different subjects that come up. Biology about living things. That's the one where you dissect the frog and you feel sick because you've opened up this frog. Or we used to have a brain in pickled water. It was the brain of a sheep that was there on the shelf. Oh, wow. That was biology. And then physics, I just remember those little diagrams with neurons, protons, and the atoms all connected to each other, and the periodic table. And then chemistry, chemical reactions. We had a great chemistry teacher who was always encouraging us to do experiments. So we would have the little test tubes, all the liquids, the Bunsen burner that would burn and heat up the liquid, and then make a record of the chemical reactions. He actually taught us the essence of research and science, how to do an experiment. And it was great. So I enjoyed chemistry classes. Enough of science. Let's move on to the next one. Art. Now, art. The questions here, for example, do you like going to museums? Well, there are many kinds of museums, right? There are art museums, there are history museums, science museums, art galleries. You can talk about any of those. Have you ever been to an art gallery? Yes, I have. I've been to lots of art galleries. I really enjoy looking at portraits. I love the facial expressions and how the artist can communicate maybe the personality of the person that they're drawing. I just find them really fascinating. So I enjoy spending a leisurely hour or two just browsing around the different rooms in an art gallery. There you go. Nice. Browsing the rooms. Portraits. So it's useful to know the basic kinds of paintings. So if you're looking at a face painting, it's called a portrait. If it's the mountains and the trees and nature, it's a landscape. If it's the sea, surprise, surprise, it's a seascape. And those pictures of a plant or a bowl of fruit, still life. Why is it called still life? I mean, surely life is alive, it's moving and it's bouncy. Mind you, apples are not very bouncy, nor are bananas. They don't move, do they? They just sit there, still life. So you may like still life paintings. And in addition to paintings, maybe you go in for sculptures, right? Which are either the face or the body made of bronze, made of stone, made of marble. There are different materials that can be used, and the sculptures represent normally people, but not always. So, do you like going to museums? Have you ever been to an art gallery? Did you take art classes when you were a child? Here you may talk more about painting and the brushes that you use and the brush stroke, whether it's a thick stroke or a thin stroke, and more about, getting your hands messy, wearing the apron and painting on a canvas. That might be more what you talk about here. I do like to dabble in painting. Ooh, there's a nice expression, to dabble in something. That's when you're not a professional, but you like to try it. Same for me. I love dabbling in cooking. I like to dabble in painting. I've done a few paintings. I like oil painting because you can smell the oil and the texture on the canvas is quite rough and it gives it a very vivid, alive feel for me. I also like to dabble in computing a little bit. So there's a nice word you can use, dabble. If you talk about art, you may want to talk about a style of art, but that's a bit higher level. There's a question here. Are there any paintings on the wall in your room? There are, and there's a painting up there actually, which is a kind of an impressionist style, the Van Gogh or the Monet style. So that might be a nice one to talk about. And next up is laughter. Now, there was a recent question about smiling, but this one is about laughter, laughing, right? You'll be familiar with the text acronym LOL, L-O-L, laugh out loud. We actually do use that, right? I was watching a program last night, The Big Bang Theory, and I was laughing out loud. It was so funny. So we do say that. With laughter, you maybe want to, well, the first question, right, is when was the last time you laughed? So maybe you talk about when you were with friends, with family, telling jokes or cracking jokes is to tell a joke. Maybe you were watching a funny TV program or a film that was a comedy or a stand-up comic or any kind of comedian. So notice it's really useful to learn the family groups of words, right? Comedy is the subject. Comedian is the person. A comic is also a person as well as a magazine. Comical means funny. So learning these parts of the word forms, that noun, adjective, verb, is really, really useful. Okay. So comedy, you may want to talk about a stand-up comic. One of my favourite stand-up comics is Peter Kay. And if you haven't watched Peter Kay. He's from the north of England, where I'm from, and he's a very down-to-earth comic. He does observational humour, and that's where you observe everyday things in life, but from a different angle to find them funny. So
open the window. Hey, it's electric. Those days are gone. Hey, none of that anymore. Electric.
So he likes observational humour. It's very deadpan humour. It's just very dry. It's not laugh out loud. It's more kind of humorous and funny, quite witty. So he's a great stand-up comic. You know, he gets up in front of the stage and just speaks. So I like him. Check him out. Do you like watching funny programs on TV? Yes, so here you could talk about observational humour. You could talk about visual humour, made very popular by Charlie Chaplin, Laurel and Hardy, more recently Mr. Bean. That's all visual humour, right? Sometimes we call it slapstick because it was in the old vaudeville halls. You remember the old films, Laurel and Hardy? It was all kind of hitting each other and turning round with a ladder and knocking somebody over. It was all very visual and funny. So maybe that, or maybe you like kind of words on play on words, where the humour is a bit more witty, it's a bit cleverer, and there's a play on words where you make the meaning of a word different, and therefore there's an unexpected surprise. You could talk about that. Do you like to make people laugh? Do you think it's important for friends to laugh together? Yes. Some great words here might be laugh out loud. Something is funny. It's hilarious, right? I find Peter Kay hilarious. Or hysterical, right? I was telling this story the other day about when I got locked in the toilet, which was quite hysterical. It wasn't at the time, but I was about to give a presentation on stage. And as you do, just before going on stage, I thought I'll nip to the toilet and couldn't get out. The door was jammed. I was stuck in there, you know, and they were on the point of announcing, and here is Mr. Keith O'Hare. And I'm in the toilet trying to open the door. Oh, it was terrible. But looking back, it was hysterical. What a great comedy scene. Hilarious. So that's laughter. Let's move on. Numbers is next. Okay. Numbers. So let's look at the questions first. Do you have a favourite number? When I asked some friends about this, we all ended up coming up with a lucky number. And I think people tend to think of lucky numbers, not favourite numbers. But that's fine. You can say, yes, my favourite number is number 3. I think it's really lucky. I can't remember why I chose that number, but I think many people choose lucky numbers from superstition, right? They believe it's just a number that will bring them luck, or maybe it's the date of birth, or the time they were born, or the month they were born in, and they think that number's lucky. This whole study, right, is called numerology. There is a science behind it. And if you're a numerologist, apologies for that, but I'm not sure that it's a real science. But the numerology, the study of numbers and what they mean. So you can visit a numerologist, and depending on the time you were born, the day, the date, and the year, they can do something a bit mystic with the numbers and tell you something magical, like what colour socks you're going to wear next week. Sorry, that's a bit facetious. They may tell you how many children you're going to have, something like that. So it is a bit mystic, but it's numerology. So you could talk about that, right? Are you good at memorising numbers? So remembering or learning by heart. I'm terrible at that. And to be honest, I don't think we need to, because we could just use computers and phones. You can type every bit of information you need. I don't think we need to remember anything apart from names, because we can just access all the information. Now, here's a funny question. Do you often use numbers to do things? What does that mean? Do you use numbers to do things? I use numbers to make a phone call. right? Of course. But I think what it means is activities that involve numbers. So personal finance, right? Do you budget? Do you do personal finance? If you do personal finance at the end of the month, or in fact during the month, you'll be keeping a tally of how much you spend, how much you earn, and making sure your books balance. So personal finance is something you may do where you use numbers. Some people cook. Oh, some people paint by numbers, don't they? You have a painting and they have the numbers, and each number corresponds to a colour, and then you just fill in the colour and you end up with a beautiful black horse. Great. There's cooking as well, right? If you're a bit of an amateur cook like me, you like to dabble in cooking. If you dabble in cooking, then you probably follow a recipe. Follow a recipe. That's a bit hard. Follow a recipe. That's like a tongue twister. Follow a recipe. If you follow a recipe. If you read a recipe, easier. If you read a recipe, 100 grams of sugar, 2 litres of stock or water, a tablespoonful of lemongrass, whatever. Numbers, right? You may need the numbers to cook and to follow your recipe. So maybe that's something you do. There's lots of things you can talk about. Would you like to have a job that deals with numbers? Which jobs deal with numbers? Well, accountant, banking, professional cook, maybe, scientists, mathematician, teachers. There's got to be loads of them, right? So you could talk about those kind of jobs. I think the key is to say whether you like numbers and if you have a good ability, are you very capable with numbers? Do you have a good aptitude for numbers? I have quite a good aptitude for numbers, so I can do them quite well. So you may want to talk about that, whether you want to have a job that uses numbers. Great. The next question is about breaks. Now, breaks sometimes means vacation. Sometimes it means break. You break your pencil. But here, I'm pretty sure it means taking a break in the working day. So you're working and you take a break. Maybe you go for a coffee. Maybe you have a stroll. Or maybe you stretch your legs. Or just go and have a chat with a colleague for a few minutes. Whatever it is, that's the break. So here, do you prefer a long break or several short breaks? Some people like to just keep working, right? They stick at it and then have a long break when they're finished. Personally, I prefer several short breaks. Even on my computer, I have a special software, the Pomodoro software, that tells me every 25 minutes, beep, 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 Keith, take a break. It doesn't say that, but it tells me it's time to take a break. Take a 5-minute break. I stand up, maybe grab a coffee or have a walk, go downstairs for a stroll. I have an apple stroll. Have you never tried the apple stroll? The apple stroll is you take an apple, you walk around the block for 10 minutes around your office or anywhere eating an apple. Great. So you can take an apple stroll, and that's a short break. And I find that helps me concentrate and I can be much more productive that way. So that's what you can do with a break. Why do you need to take a break? Because you would go crazy if you don't take a break. The mind can only concentrate for a certain amount of time. There's the Pareto principle, right? The 80-20, which means that basically 80% of your productivity comes from 20% of the time. That means 80% of your time you're basically wasting because you're not productive, because you're not concentrating or focused. Mind-blowing. Go and check it out, the Pareto principle. It'll change the way you work. And if you use that in your IELTS test, it'll change your score for the better. Okay, breaks. Let's move on. Running. There was recently the question about walking. Now it's about running. And I wonder if this is because the whole issue of our sedentary lifestyle, obesity, people not moving enough is becoming an issue. And so I've noticed health and obesity, running, exercise are all coming up a lot more. So here the questions are, do you like running? Where do you usually go running? Have you ever run a long distance? Do you think running is a good way to stay healthy? Now, what you may be thinking is, hang on, if I don't like running, I'm going to say no. Do you like running? No. Where do you usually go running? I don't. Have you ever run a long distance? No, I just told you. Do you think running is a good way to stay healthy? No, I just told you I don't like running. Are you listening to me? Now, there's the problem, but it's not a problem, right? So if you don't like running, that's fine. Just say, I don't like running. But develop your answer. For example, do you like running? No, I don't. I prefer walking. I find walking much more relaxing and gives me the kind of energy I need each day. Okay? So, no, I prefer And just talk a little bit about that. So if you say no, the examiner's going to skip. He's not going to say, or she is not going to say, where do you usually go running, right? Unless they really want to test you, but the chances are they will skip that and say, have you ever run a long distance? Now, even though you said, no, I don't like running, they could say, have you ever run a long distance? Because think about it. Most of us have had to run at some time. At school, we had to run cross country, right? We had to run out into the mountains around Manchester for 2 hours, running and running. We had to run a long distance. If you were in some countries, you have military service, right? And you have to train as a soldier for either 2 weeks or a year. And, you probably had to run a long distance. And the reason a lot of people don't like running is because they had to run when they were kids and they didn't like it. So there's a good chance you could talk about when you had to run a long distance. And then, do you think running is a good way to stay healthy? Well, yes, you can talk about it's aerobic, it's a cardiovascular exercise, is that right? It's an aerobic exercise. It's good for your heart. It helps you pump blood and energy and oxygen, not energy. It helps you pump oxygen around your body into your brain. It gets you moving. So it's actually a great sport. That said, it puts a lot of pressure on your joints, especially the knee joints and the hip joints. And some people end up having operations if they've spent their whole life running on their knees or their hips. So it's good and bad. That's it. That's running. Let's move on. There's a question about wild animals. So what do we mean by wild animals? Well, basically not tame. So a wild animal lives in the wild. So essentially it feeds itself and it finds its own home. So any kind of pet, like a dog or a cat, is not a wild animal. But dogs that live in the wild, like the dingo in Australia, they are wild animals. And there are some cats that are wild, right? They're also wild animals. Typically, people think of the lion, the elephant, the gorilla, things like that, which are obviously wild animals in the wild. And you could say, I've seen a lion in the zoo. So it's still a wild animal, but it's in the zoo, and that changes things. And I think one of the questions is, do you like to go to the zoo? Have you ever seen wild animals before? Which do you like the most? So yes, you can talk about, the lions and the elephants and why you like them and where you've seen them at the zoo or maybe on safari. But you can also talk about animals in your country. So in England, we've got foxes and rabbits, badgers, birds, a plethora of birds that are wild animals and that you could talk about. So there's a lot of things you can talk about there. And the last one I'm going to look at today is spending time by yourself, being alone. Do you like spending time by yourself? I do, actually. I like having a bit of time to myself because it helps me think and reflect and gather my thoughts together so I can really plan what I want to do. I'm not a very gregarious or social person, so although I enjoy being with people, I do value my own time. And then the other questions about how you spend the time when you're by yourself. What did you do last time when you were by yourself? So here they're talking about general habits and then one particular time in the past. So notice the difference about, yes, I usually sit at home on the sofa and read a book in the present, and last time I remember I was in a library, I was on my own, I was reading a book, I completed the whole book in the past tense. So just be aware of the tenses there as well. And that brings us to the end, I think, of all the new questions that have come out for IELTS Speaking Part 1. Some of the older questions are still there, so things about haircuts and wearing jeans, there it's still coming up or appearing in the next 4 months. So I share all of this with you, not to memorize all of this, right, but to give you ideas and language that you can start using flexibly. Flexibility is the secret. Keep practicing, take the phrases, the collocations, and go for it. If you want to find out more, please visit IELTSSpeakingSuccess.com. There are lots of resources there, and that will really help you improve and get ready for IELTS. It's been a pleasure seeing you here today. I hope this helps. Take care. Bye-bye.